All right, so welcome everyone to the Writing Up Mixed Methods training session. This is put together by CLEAR and the IndigiLab network, of which CLEAR is a member, and so it'll be recorded. My name is Dr. Max Liboiron. I run CLEAR Lab, and I also co-direct the IndigiLab network. And we specialize in community-based work with Indigenous communities, so there'll be a lot of inflections of that, but what we talk about should work with any kind of community that you work with. I'm going to talk a little bit about what this is and isn't, and then we'll get into some of the principles and stuff. So, hang on one second while I get my ducks in a row. There are the ducks. All right, so one of the things, this is mostly going to be about guidelines and principles, not rules. For what you're doing, rules about how to do this should be determined with and by the communities whose knowledge you're dealing with. But a lot of this is going to hold across those cases. The other assumption is we're working with both quantitative and qualitative research in these situations, and they're all community-based, and in many cases, I'm talking about Indigenous and local knowledge, which is largely qualitative, and then Western science is largely quantitative. This doesn't mean that communities can't make quant and scientists can't make qual, but on the whole, that's what I'm talking about. And when I'm talking about local knowledge, I specifically mean local knowledge, which means personal and community experience and observation, which can include measurement, validation, theorization. And I am not talking in this case about traditional knowledge. So first principles, sacred knowledge, deliberative knowledge, AKA governance, conduct. There's often overlap between those two things, but if you're dealing with Indigenous traditional knowledge, there's just a whole lot of other rules and things about sharing, not sharing, when to share, when not to share, what you can and cannot do with that, that will exceed what I talk about in this. So I'm mostly sticking with local knowledge, observational knowledge, and theorization based on that kind of observation. And again, the other thing about what I'm talking about today will be once you have the data, how you move it and maneuver it together, not collecting the data. So the assumption is already you have a pile of numbers, quotes, input, et cetera, information. There are other sessions about how to gather that data. All right, so that was the introduction. Then we'll talk about a few premises, some of the assumptions and things that underlie this kind of work, principles or guidelines, and then some strategies, both in what'll be your methods section and in the findings section. Because again, the assumption is that if you're doing scientific quant, you are probably not locked in, but like heavily influenced into a structure that is methods, findings, discussion. That's not true of all sort of research outputs, but that's often the case. So, all right, so some premises. So one of the first premises that is foundational to this kind of work is that community have rights. They're not stakeholders, they're rights holders. And this is especially true of Indigenous groups that have very concrete, well laid out rights, but other types of communities also have rights. Scientists don't have the same kind of rights, or researchers don't have the same kind of rights. So that becomes one of the sort of the underlying commitments or orientations of this kind of work. And this will show up in different ways that we'll go through in the strategies. The other thing is that science and its numbers, the quant, and the knowledge system called Western science, no matter what individuals may think, are dominant. That means it's the truthiest form of knowledge, irrespective of premise number one, having rights. And so part of this work, a really crucial part of this work, is maneuvering the tensions between premise one and premise two, right? The idea of dominance and rights. Premise number three, though, is that numbers are not the opposite of community. That includes the idea, there's a great book called Indigenous Statistics by Maggie Walter and Chris Anderson. And they talk about this problem where, especially in Indigenous communities, but I think this generalizes to other types of communities too, the assumption is that quantitative reasoning is somehow anti-Indigenous or anti-community or imposed fundamentally, but all sorts of communities, including Indigenous ones, have traditions of numeracy, have numerical understandings that are often not identical to Western science, but that doesn't make them the opposite. And starting from an assumption that quantitative work is automatically bad for community is a really rough start, especially in community relations or something like that. So that's something to think about as you go forward. And then finally, because of all these things, there's always a power imbalance. And I just don't mean here that Western science is the dominant form of knowledge, but also that between researchers and community members. So benefits and power consistently accrue to researchers and their institutions. And this is true no matter what you might personally want to do or think. And this is especially true if you are a researcher who is also a community member. So in the case of a lot of the folks I work with, you're an Indigenous researcher going into often your own community, and that just gets real tricky. Real complicated ethics, real complicated power dynamics. You don't get to choose which hat you wear when, that sort of stuff. That's a whole other training situation on its own, and we will have trainings about that in the IndigiLab network. But it's just another thing to keep in mind. And so with all of these principles together, these are the things you have to keep in mind when you're doing something like choosing a statistical model. It's not just about statistical fit. It's also about how does that statistical fit link into all of these different things, because it will. All right, so those are principles. Questions, Evan? I can't see everyone at the same time, so you might have to chat if you want to.
Just a question about the quantitative reasoning versus being interpreted by anti-community. I guess you're not going to try to address that in this workshop, but how do you approach that?
Yeah, so I mean, all communities have some kind of tradition or type of numeracy. It's impossible that people aren't doing observations of some kind and categorizing things, which is a human intellectual activity, and that sort of stuff, without some form of numeracy behind it. So there is an IndigiLab network working group called Indigenous Quant, the Indigenous Quantitative Methods Working Group. And one of the things we started with were, what are the traditions of numeracy in your nations? What like language is it? What traditions? And people could find them literally in the landscapes. So, oh, the rocks that get marked like this, what you know is if it's this length from over here, then it means it's that much farther to water, or the edge of the cow pasture, something like that. And you can move that into cartography, you can move that into quant, you can move that into numeracy pretty easily. I know a lot of people at Memorial, where we're based, work with fishing, people who fish, and like the logbooks of a fisherman are like sophisticated data sets. And there's quite a lot of quantitative literacy in that. So yeah, just to being aware of some of those and having local people work with you to help you learn about some of those if you're not already aware is really useful. Yeah, we'll put it on there for now, but I would highly, if this is, you're like, ooh, I've never thought of that before, the Indigenous Statistics book by Walter and Anderson is really, really good on this point. Yeah, and the introduction in particular. Yeah. There's also things like the Cree Dictionary of Mathematics, which if you speak Cree is like amazing, and this sort of stuff. Yeah, there's also traditions of, say, ethno-mathematics. A lot of that is like very Western, white-centered, looking out at other cultures sort of stuff, but it still shows that, look, numeracy is not the opposite of various types of community. So, all right, on to principles. So premises are sort of the things we have to account for and things we inherit. Principles are things we're going to use to guide us in that sticky set of premises. So the first is that local knowledge and Western science, which is usually quantitative, are fundamentally different and cannot be simply integrated. When I see the word integration and like that's where it's left, I assume the person is either lying or they're sloppy. In in most cases, in most dominant cases where local knowledge and science, quantitative-based science are integrated, it looks like this. Validation, where Western science validates that what Indigenous people or other communities think is actually true, instead of which questions the validity of the knowledge, the local knowledge to begin with, right? So this is something we want to avoid because it reinscribes a lot of those power dynamic premises that we were talking about, with some caveats, which we'll get to. So when I see words like combination, validation, integration, collaboration, partnership, co-production, and also words like weaving, braiding, and two-eyed seeing, a lot of these, and then nothing else to describe actually, given that things are different, how were they related? These things all apply a sort of equality and bringing together, but because they are not equal, and because the bringing together, if it's not explicit, I just assume that those premises remain the same. And we've got some like nice window dressing, and that does happen a lot. And it is a problem in the research into communities, and it's something that communities talk about quite a lot, different communities. So this means pretty much the number one thing you have to figure out as a researcher is what is the actual relation between these different forms of knowledge. And also I'm talking as if these forms of knowledge are monoliths. They're also not, but within local knowledge and within quant knowledge, scientific quant knowledge, there's a lot of similitude, while across them there isn't. So yeah. So, oh, this is a big chunk. So one of the stakes of not figuring out the difference, if you just pop them side by side, this is a long quote from a text by, oh, I forget her last name, Sarah Blackner, where she's analyzing a Western scientist working with Indigenous communities about contamination. And she says one of the things that comes up a lot in this kind of work is that there are actually fundamentally different interpretations of the data between communities and scientists. And these tend to lead in very different directions in terms of futuring, what the future looks like for those communities and their land. And so that is the stake at not figuring out the relation and dealing with those power imbalances. And those are pretty high stakes because they impact the lives of communities. So what do you do? So the number, because of the power imbalances, the number one thing you do is you give community priority, because it's starting skewed. So giving community priority might only mitigate that skew. It doesn't necessarily make them even or even bring the community in front. But by giving community priority, you start to address those power dynamics. And one of the ways you can do that is that community defines the terms, whatever terms, the categories, the terms of art, the definitions of the main thing you're studying, whatever that may be. So this is a quote from Text on Land Back by Kelsey Leonard et al. And I think there are like 22 authors on this piece. And it's saying, for our Indigenous author team, our communities, meaning our home communities, I'm a co-author on this piece, and within the Indigenous produced research, water back means, and then gave it. So they've actually got three sort of overlapping communities here, which sort of strengthens the community definition work. And then all the rest of the text was about water back based on this definition that we came from. And if something fell outside of this definition, it didn't get included. So that's one strategy. Another strategy, oh, these are out of order, that's okay. Which methods are most meaningful? So same text as before, and this is actually about a lit review as opposed to a quantitative sort of method, although we'll get into different chunks of a quantitative method. But they're basically say, yeah, this isn't a normal lit review, this is an Indigenous lit review, and it comes out of these community-based values. Here's what they are, and here's how they get operationalized in our lit review, which was very, very different and took way longer than your average lit review, because Indigenous methods always take longer. It's one of their hallmarks, if not a goal. So what about actual quant methods? Well, the most obvious, and I think most intuitive for most folks, is what and why you sample and where, right? So this is one of the cases that I use a lot, Athabasca et al. It's sometimes called McLaurin et al. McLaurin was the white Western non-Indigenous researcher who compiled things, but when the nations cite it, they cite the nations, not the guy. So this has a bunch of layers of reasoning behind a research design. So they were interested in us testing muskrats. It's great importance, right? So there's cultural importance for muskrats. And according to elders, the presence of muskrats is what scientists would call a key indicator species. And we heard community members saying that they've been theorizing that muskrats populations are declining, especially close to the Athabasca River, which is where the tar sands contaminate sort of most. And so this is why we sampled muskrats. Right, so there's a bunch of different layers so remember, local knowledge involves not just observation, but also theorization, making connections in the world, numeracy, that sort of stuff. So you can bring all those things in together into a sampling design. Which measures or metrics, depending on your language, are most meaningful? So same report. This is celium in duck. And every time these folks talk about a contaminant in wild food, they do have the measures of the contaminant in food, but they always have the consumption advisories. Always. You don't have to put a consumption advisory in your paper, but that's what, so like the community might be like, okay, but what does that mean? This is what that means. Like, what does 6 mean? 6 means you can eat this much liver per week. Oh, and this much if you're pregnant. Oh, right. So using a metric or a measure that has meaning in the community, and the way you know if it has meaning in the community is the community tells you. And that is literally the only way you can tell, because I have assumptions about that and I'm almost always wrong. And I've worked with the community I've worked with for 8 years. Another measure that matters, so this is from one of our reports, which is in progress and doesn't have a full author list yet. So we study plastic pollution in wild food, among other things. And one of the metrics that is most common in Western science is the percentage of animals that you've studied that have eaten plastic. But what we lead with are ones that have not eaten plastic, to highlight that these are actually really high numbers and the safety of wild food. So this one at the bottom, Northern Fulmar, no one eats it. Well, maybe someone eats it, but the community definitely doesn't eat it. This is not something the community did not say, we would like you to please highlight the percentage of animals that did not eat plastic, but the community did say, hey, are wild food safe to eat? And we're like, totally. They're like, all your communications highlight that. And so we've switched our metrics, our measures to highlight that sort of thing. Which models are most meaningful to community? This is something we've been working on for a long time, and it takes a lot of work. Some of what we've done is called participatory statistics, which are methods where you work with community members in real time with your data sets, doing your statistics, and you narrate what's happening. And this was used a lot in CUNY, the City University of New York, in participatory action research work around stop and frisk, which is where police stop and frisk someone, and if they have, for whatever, which just increases the chance that they will end up in jail. And this was happening in primarily Black communities. And so they worked with some folks in different groups in Harlem, and they called participatory action research, or sorry, participatory statistics, the bullshit game. So they would say, according to the numbers, per neighborhood, there is no difference in the rates that police stop and frisk people between Black and white. And the folks they were working with say, bullshit. Please check for, please change your, they didn't say change your categories or change your bins, but they basically said, please correct for where our kids are going to school versus where they live, and so do time of day as to which communities they're in for school versus which communities they're in for home. And then they recorrelated that, and they're like, oh yeah, okay, yeah. Now we can see that there's really much higher stop and frisk at school time where your kids go to school, and at home time when your kids are at home. So they would do this sort of thing, do different, somewhat descriptive but inferential statistics, and the community would validate it essentially until it would form into a set of models and a set of bins categories that were truthy. And I added a lot more nuance as well. This is a case in the research that I'm doing with Nunatsiavut. This is in progress, which is why the Inuktitut is not there yet. But it says, if you can't read it, when we look for plastics in Nunatsiavut, what we find most of the time is nothing. This is the visualization of a mean as opposed to an average. Sorry, a median instead of a mean. Means and averages, of course, the same thing. So most of the median of plastics in wild food in Nunatsiavut is 0. The average is, I don't know, depends on the animal, but it's around 0.3-ish or lower, 0.35 maybe, in some animals. So, but hey, if there's 0.35 plastics in your average animal, does not make more sense in most animals have nothing, haven't eaten plastics. One of those is much more meaningful and also true. So most science in plastic pollution uses averages, not medians. And what we're finding over and over again is that medians, the ugly stepsister of averages in your introductory stats class, is actually a lot more meaningful and true in our cases, which was a surprise to us, but there we go. So something that's simple, that's just a descriptive statistic. And this is the model that fit better. Which models are most meaningful? Here's another example. This one is made from Indigenous Statistics, and this is Maggie Walter talking about one of her studies where she used the same number as non-Maori statisticians to look at socioeconomic position of Maori in the nation. And what the non-Maori statisticians binned locations in such a way that they could say, oh, when Maori are here or there, or in these numbers or those numbers, they have more money or they have better class. And what she did is she changed the bins for locations to be more reflective of iwis, meaning tribes where they lived, and found that the socioeconomic position was pretty constant. So it was about being Indigenous as opposed to being about where you were. Based on, it's ecological fallacy for those of you who have a lot of depth into different models. And when she changed the binning to be more reflective of Indigenous geographies, a very different meaning emerged. So that's a community priority in that. Which bins or categories are most meaningful? So quote for me, when is spring? When is spring? When does it start? When does it end? When is summer? When does summer end? I don't know, mostly because I'm not from Nunatsiavut, and what I take to be a harbinger of spring is not the same as a harbinger of spring in Nunatsiavut. And it took us a long time and we made many mistakes until we finally talked to the Flowerses, which is Nick and Ruben Flowers, who were like, oh, to a char, summer is over the last full moon of August, because that's when the water is highest and they get their boost into freshwater, where they then spend the winter. That's the end of that season. Okay. And for seals, it's totally different because it has to do with ice and stuff like that. So when seasons changed, what the edges of the seasons were and when the seasons were different for each animal and also different up and down the coast. And so when we bin our data to see whether there are changes in plastic consumption in different seasons, the bins are determined by local knowledge, which is good because when we used months, we had very different results. So thank you to the Flowerses. All right, so those were all about community priority as a way to figure out the relation, where the relation was always like, okay, local knowledge is what shapes what comes after. Now I'm going to talk about different strategies that have to do with difference, right? This idea that local knowledge and scientific quantitative knowledge are actually very different. Even if you've got local numeracy and scientific numeracy, they're very, very different, and we're going to keep them different. I often think of the two-row wampum when I think about this, which is a treaty with folks from Southern Connecticut, Northern New York, that basically said, we'll walk in the same direction, but we're not going to integrate, we're not going to twist, and that is actually a good relation. So inherently integrating is not automatically good. And we have lots of models and examples that show us that. So this is, again, the Athabasca Chipewyan study. We're up here about beavers. We have the local knowledge, which is about how beavers taste and how that taste has been changing over time. And then down here, we have arsenic in beavers. And there is no effort to say, oh, the taste is changing because the arsenic, or the arsenic is changing the taste, or anything like that, because who knows? And also that wasn't the point of research and it wasn't meaningful. They just were left separate. There's something going on with beavers changing. There's some arsenic in beavers. Next part. And this report will keep some things separate and put some things together. And we'll talk about when it does that and when it doesn't do that, possibly in the next slide. Yeah, bringing it together. So there are other places in the same study where all the different forms of knowledge on a particular topic are brought together in conversation. And sort of just like a literature review, you use sort of different sources to start to build through an argument. So this particular one is about the transition from wild food to store-bought foods. And so they've got a survey. They've got some direct quotes from interviews, which were separate from the survey. There wasn't like a big quote thing in the survey. And then more survey stuff again. And they weave it together to start building an argument where the local knowledge nuances while the quantitative knowledge sort of broadens it. So you've got depth and breadth. And depth is what happens with the local knowledge, and breadth, is what happens with the statistics to sort of show population versus experience. And it moves back and forth as it builds through that. So it starts with a population measure, goes into nuance, and then the next population measure takes some of that nuance with it to help with interpretation. So it doesn't, in this case, they decided not to keep them separate. Here's another one. We'll talk a little bit about the principle of symmetry in a minute, but this is a sentence that is almost made in a draft where hunters in Hopedale, citation, and scientists in Norway, citation, have observed the same thing. For prioritization, hunters go first, local knows goes first, and then scientific, and they both get treated with a citation, even though Flowers, both of the Flowerses will be co-authors in this piece, they also still get cited for their particular local knowledge. Another strategy, be specific about what aspects of the same topic are understood by each. In scientific and technology studies, this is called the multiplicity. It means the example where this theory comes out is in Anne-Marie Moll's The Body Multiple, where she studies arteriosclerosis, the hardening of the arteries. And she says arteriosclerosis are very different things to different people. To surgeons, they're the diameter of the vein or artery, arterial artery. To patients, it's pain walking. To this person, and it's all the same thing. And it doesn't mean one is or less is true. It means there's multiple aspects to this thing, and it doesn't always have to cohere into a coherent thing. It can stay in its multiplicity. But in the Athabasca et al. Study, whenever community talks about duck, they say duck, and whenever the lab talks about it, they say duck meat, because the lab has never met a duck. They have only met duck meat. And so when the lab is talking, they're like, all we can talk about is duck meat. That is our purview. And when the community is talking about, they're like, we're talking about ducks, which sometimes includes duck meat, but in a different way than the laboratory talks about duck meat. So they use different terms for it. So that kind of specificity about when they're both talking about this animal, but they're also maintaining difference at the same time. And it's subtle, but it's, I think, very meaningful. And it also helps when you're analyzing things to accidentally think that maybe in the lab you're talking about ducks, which I think sometimes we think we are. Okay, this is very long, so I'll just summarize for you. So the top, this is about the numbers and prevalences of certain cancers. And the fact that if someone was in the survey, this is from the information from the survey about health, if they worked for the oil sands, they had or if they increased a lot of traditional foods, there was a higher incidence of cancer. And so this is the numbers, and then the interpretation is back to local knowledge. So when human health was examined as a whole, so not just the cancers, but also broader things, participants identified oil sands as the cause of health decline. And then they could order sort of the different aspects of the tar sands that cause this. So yeah, even though same conversation, different chunks of the idea of cancer or health or wellness is the domain of the different knowledge types. All right, strategy, principle of symmetry. So this is a concept that I'm using unfaithfully from science and technology studies that basically says, even if one thing is considered to be of less importance or have a lot less power, you don't actually treat it differently than the thing with power, and vice versa. So in this case, a lot of finding sections talk about, so let's say you have a bunch of data and you can't tell whether it's a normal distribution or not. So you do a test to see if it's normal distribution, and then you try a couple of different models, some of which rely on a normal distribution, some which don't. In the findings, then you say, these are the models that worked, these are the models that didn't, we're going to build off of these models, we're not going to build off of those models, la 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 la. You can do the same thing for the things you did around your local knowledge activities. So this, I was reminded of this from reading Riley Cotter's thesis draft, whose opening finding was, did the community consultation work? How can I tell? What are the indicators, qualitative and quantitative, that would lead me to know whether it worked or not, to tell me how good my local data actually is? You do the same thing for quant. How good is my quantitative data? This much certainty, this kind of good. You do the same thing with local knowledge. Because even if local knowledge is good, just like, it doesn't mean that you did a good job of getting it, which might impact what kind and quality of local knowledge you got, which is a research thing. Mark the science. So even because Western science and quantitative methods are dominant, they often are just taken as the thing. And while local knowledge will be like, and Hunter said, and the community desired, or something like that. But the science will just be like, it's green, or it's 32%. So one of the things that the Athabasca study does all the time is they mark everything. When it's local folks who say things, they say local folks. When it's science who say things, they say according to science. So they mark it. So it's not the unmarked norm or default. And that goes back to the premises about power relations. You think of things like mankind or women firefighter or these sorts of things. What gets marked and what isn't marked. You don't say man firefighter, you say woman firefighter, because you have to mark the exception and the dominant thing stays unmarked. So they reverse that in this case. And then the flip side of that is Western scientists also have local knowledge. And if you have a lot of stories and quotes, you can have that from science too. So this is another pull from the In Progress piece we're doing on plastics in Ignatziavut. And this is a lab technician talking about her observations, her qualitative observations, and how she came to know plastics. These sort of breakouts usually include sort of local quotes and hunters talking and that sort of stuff. But here we have a bunch that also are lab technicians, which do the same sort of work. They do depth while other numbers do breadth. Or population or across a sample. And this is like, let me tell you about the experience of microfibers. It's wild, even somewhere like microfibers are this big. They're so small, let me tell you about them. So that it adds that kind of nuance the same way other qualitative data does. All right. The big question is, if the number one principle is to figure out the relationship between these two types of knowledge, how do you tell? If you're using local knowledge from communities, it is determined by the communities. And that is because of those power relations, but also because these things are how you use different forms of knowledge and for what is always strategic. It's not like there's a bare truth out there And if you just line up your quant well and line up your local well, it'll be the truthiest. There are different kinds of truth for different types of things, as we know. And it's always, and how you use knowledge and for what is always strategic for everything. So this is another quote from the Athabasca study. And they're really specific about what the traditional knowledge, this was traditional knowledge as opposed to local knowledge and the overlap. They say, well, the traditional knowledge provides a really clear description of the changes and how things combine and interact. It also directed the scientific data collection. It provided a lot of context. The context and terms help us understand the data and make it more credible with community. The scientific data, on the other hand, helps support the traditional knowledge in ways that make it truthy to governments and industry. So that was the strategy. The point of bringing in the Western science was to make it more resonant with governments and industry. So even though local folks already knew something, brought in Western science so that governments and industry also believed them. And that's strategic. And the strategies of how you do and do not use the different knowledge does have to come from community, because strategies are all about reaching goals and making sort of futures more or less possible through knowledge. And that is up to the community. So for instance, when I said, don't validate in the direction where scientific knowledge validates traditional knowledge, if that's strategic, if community wants that, then you still do it. Right? So strategy always goes on the side of the needs, priorities, and self-determination of the communities. And that can include things like strategic, what is it called? Strategic essentialism, which is like kind of reductive stuff, but it helps further a goal. Does it make it untrue? No, you never do anything that's untrue, but truth isn't a thing that stands by itself. There's a lot of interpretation, power dynamics, and context in truths. So that is the prepared stuff. Here's my work cited, which we can gaze upon. There's really only a few key texts I used. There's the Athabasca et al. Piece, as well as some of the other ones. And I will, when this becomes a video on IndigiLab Network, I will post the work cited as well. But in the meantime, we have a good amount of time together to talk about what you are working on and your struggles and how you're working to put together different kinds of quant and qual, where the qual is local knowledge, and maybe some of the quant is too, which is even better. And a reminder that this is being recorded. So if you want to ask a question, but you don't want to be recorded, then just put it in the chat. And thank you. And thank you for the couple people who just clapped. I can see you. So are there particular things that you're working on or questions you have that you would like a group brain on? Paul, did you have a thing, or did you just turn on your camera? You don't have a thing?
Turn on my camera.
Okay.
So you aren't just staring at black boxes all over.
Okay. Evan.
I wanted to go back to a question about citation. So you brought up the case of citing the Flowers et al. Example.
Yeah.
So that's taking the local knowledge and putting it into the in a format that the Western science will accept, so we can get it published.
Yes and no. So yes, absolutely, it does do that. But it also comes out of, Katrina, who's here in the room, runs our community authorship working group, which is all about, when we work with community members and local knowledge, how do they actually want to be credited for their work? Right. Okay. Because yeah, I'd be like, oh, citation, that's already a good thing, we'll just do that. And what if they said no? Or what if they had different reasons or ways of understanding that? And they do have different ways of understanding that. But one of the things is, first of all, local knowledge isn't data, it's intellectual property. And so that's how you treat it, not as data, but as their own theorizations and their own knowledge and their own numeracies. And then second, I did mention that we do co-authorship with everyone whose local knowledge is in part of our work. And they have said, even if I'm an author, I also want a line by line sort of acknowledgement, because our local knowledges are really different in this community. So hunters know things that people who prepare food know less about. People who prepare food know things that hunters don't know. Or when we talk together, so, or elders know things, and those things need to be respected back to those elders rather than just being local knowledge, because it's not actually spread across the community. So citations are one way we do that. You could also just name people. Reuben Flowers said la la la. But because of that premise of the power relation, we use a citation as well. Yeah.
So that's my question is, so using that one as an example, how do you go about making it into a citation that a journal will accept?
Oh, so luckily there is now a ton of different, like APA has one, MLA has one, Chicago has one, Nature and Science both have specific ones about how you cite elders. And it's based on, but is not the same as personal communications. And sometimes you can use personal communications depending on what other people don't have. There's also some way that you had the knowledge. So if it happened during an event, you can cite that person during the event. So it fits into other conventions, but almost every citational format now has something for traditional knowledge specifically.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah, it's great. Yeah, so if you just Google it, it's like, here you go. I'm like, oh, thank you, cut and paste. I love the Google. Anything else? Veronica.
So when you're working with community members and you're telling their story or telling a story, so if you're talking directly with a community member and they tell you the story and you're picking what you're going to write from that story, maybe not the whole story, but parts of it. Do you suggest that you give that whole writing to that person and ask them if they agree with it, or is it just...
So that is a best practice in a lot of feminist, Indigenous, community-based research. It is the exception in things like journalism and stuff like that. But it is a pretty normal method to do. What is it called? Member checking. Sometimes it's called ground truthing. But yeah, to give it back, we deal with that mostly by having those folks be co-authors with us, which I know is not how everyone does it. But it means all co-authors have to see things before it gets handed in. That's not so that's how we deal with it. But you can also just send it to them. When I've been in studies, when people are using my knowledge in a study, often they'll just send me this snippet, and I'm like, I have to see what you've written on either side of it, because yes, that's what I said, but I have no idea if you've interpreted it well. So please give me the paragraphs on either side of it. And that's often where I'm like, oh yeah, no, when I said that word, I actually meant this, and here's the lineage of that. Oh, okay, here you go, like that sort of stuff. So yeah, that's a best practice, and there's academic methodological words for that. Yeah, like member checking.
So does that also count when you're doing your thesis or your, like in our case? Yeah.
I should hope so. I mean, you're junior researchers, so double checking, triple checking is actually, everyone needs to do it, and junior researchers need to do it twice as often. So yeah.
Perfect. Good.
Yeah, or if you're in a new context. Anything else? If not, we get to go early and we have a magical extra little bit of time in our Friday. Paul? And also, if you raise your hand and I don't see you, it's because I can't see everyone. So you might have to stick something in the chat. Paul? Or just start talking.
Yeah. Well, if anyone else had their hand up before me, but Max, I really liked how you phrased, and I've done some of this in my previous work around, and Riley, in quoting Riley, around collected knowledge, but do we know, and how are we kind of confident in that we did it well? And so there's and of course talk about that in statistics as well. How certain are we that we did this well? And I'm curious if so that we're kind of like, as you talk about the way we talk about things, right? And not always, and instead of shifting and maybe moving how we talk about things between different parts of knowledge collection and research. Do you have a sense of, or have you done, or how do you think about maybe going the other way and talking about being confident in science and confident in statistics and certain of the statistical knowledge we have in a way that is using the language of and terminology of and grounded in the values of, yeah, you know what I'm asking? Like, yeah.
Yeah. So how do you make sure that your stats are actually meaningful in community?
And yeah, and also in thinking about the sort of power relations around how we talk about and
Yeah.
use language of different forms of knowledge collection, actually bringing the values and language from collecting and working with local knowledge to talking about statistics.
Yeah. So that's really, I thought that was going to be fairly straightforward when I was working. Like, you talk to community and they're like, "Oh, that," and you're like, "Great, we're done now." But I am finding that has actually taken years and many, many, many back and forths with as many different people in community as possible who have insights. So, for example, the dominant metric in plastic pollution science for plastic ingestion is called frequency of occurrence. It's a population measure that says how many animals in the population that you measured ingested plastics. That's what I mentioned it briefly before. That is the dominant measure. And I was using it for a while, and no one said anything about it. So no one told me it was wrong. But the more I talked to people, the more I noticed no one said anything about it. And people would consistently say things about other parts of the measures that weren't common in plastic pollution research, but because they asked me, I went and dug out the numbers and that sort of stuff. So it probably took me like 3 years of regularly talking to communities and having community members on my team and having a research partner who's a community member before I realized that there was a consistent absence of interest. And then I started realizing that actually any of our population measures were basically not of interest. People were not interested in char. They were interested in that char over there, or those chars based in place, or springtime char, which is not the same as char at all when you're doing your stats. And so as far as community is concerned, the category of char was not a meaningful category, which kind of blew my mind as someone who is trained exclusively in population statistics in the plastic world. So yeah, and then the problem becomes, in plastic science, there aren't other measures really that mirror what they're mirroring, what the community is talking about. And so I have to go, luckily I work with an ornithologist, and there's this like bird niche way to talk about plastics that doesn't go with other animals, and we've been borrowing that for other animals. And so yeah, so trying to figure out what are measures that are more meaningful has taken a really long time in that case. But I think it's lots of conversations. Yeah, and I think also you do again, as long as you're always doing things that are true, that you're fairly confident about, and as long as you're dealing with the premises around power, you're doing okay. You can obviously do better and better and better. But like, a master's student cannot have 4 years of conversation before they realize, oh my God, no one's picking up our population measures, even though everyone's very polite about them and continue to host us and continue to want to work with us. So you still, yeah. Renee has a question in the chat. Would it be best practice to include focus group participants as co-authors? The project is Native-led and the participants are Native as well, and we are all members of a Native training program. No worries if this is a discussion for later. So that's a genuine question that you would bring to them, because being a co-author is not inherently the best way to credit people for their work. It has a lot of implications, but what we're finding is, and Katrina, you feel free to say more about this if you want, but what we're finding is, even when we explain some of the heaviness of being an author and what that means for accountability, what that means for this sort of stuff, community members across different communities in different contexts are consistently saying like, yes, and also credit me in this, and this other way too. So like, for instance, they're saying, all of us need to be in all the pictures. So enough pictures of seals by themselves already. All 7 of us who are involved in helping you get the seals, we need to be in the pictures. and in the author list, and in acknowledgements, and in the lines when someone says something differently, and please dedicate this to so-and-so, right? So there's a bunch of different ways that we didn't think about attributing intellectual property and input in our studies. But I would say the best practice is to have that conversation, and yeah, and it's tricky, and it's a lot of work, and it takes a lot of time. We have, at this point, I think we have 127 co-authors on one of our reports, because we do a lot of community monitoring. And it's like we hire someone who is there in my screen. Their entire job is looking after that list and talking to people, because that's how heavy it gets. So yeah, working with local knowledge is a really heavy lift. It's particularly difficult for junior folks and graduate students who are on a timeline to do it, because it can take so much time to do properly first, and then well. If proper is like, okay, you haven't caused harm, and then well is like the bonus stuff, and it just takes a really long time. So if you have a funding envelope that ends or that sort of stuff, maybe don't do it. Yeah, it's not inherently good to do work with local knowledge. It's inherently hard and tricky and takes a long time. Because then, so one of the things we haven't talked about is now you have a bunch of local knowledge. When you do quantitative stuff, the university will be like, how are you going to take care of this data now? And you say, I will keep it on a locked, password protected file for 5 to 10 years or whatever the thing is. But what about the local knowledge? Especially if it involves local theorization, intellectual property, that kind of stuff. How are you going to look after it? There's a book called, oh, it's right here. Digital Bundle by Jennifer Wegmoz. That's all about, okay, you have the stories now, you have to look after them for generations. And you're like, oh no, that's so much work. And she's like, yeah, it is. You're like, well, that's what you bit off when you asked for this kind of work. So it is a heavy lift, and there is a bunch of stuff you have to think about that is important and meaningful and has high stakes. Anything else?
Max, I just have a question on that.
Yeah.
Does it matter? So does it matter in your study when you ask for this? If it wasn't in the beginning of your study that this was thought of? Oh,
I don't think no plan exists the field, right? Or whatever no research design exists its implementation, or whatever the bumper sticker is for that. And if your study hasn't changed as you progressed, it means you're not learning in time with your study. And so I always think when studies change, that's a very, very good sign. Yeah, absolutely. So I think like doing the work, working with the numbers, that sort of stuff accomplishes thought, and you will end up in new territory. So yeah, you can be like, oh, whoops, that was wrong. And then you drag it into the future, and yeah, or in the present, and then work on it. Absolutely. Katrina has written, I think a lot of people are used to being dismissed and excluded. I think the discussions right now are a lot about helping people involved in research understand that we are not doing this how people typically have done research, and then allowing them to say where and how they would like to be acknowledged for the different ways that they've contributed to the local knowledge portion. Absolutely. What I think is amazing and what Katrina is working on is that there's really high agreement in different communities when people are 8 years old versus when they're 70 years old, when people are school teachers versus when they're primarily hunters. And that has surprised me. I thought we'd have to do a lot more facilitation, but yeah. Facilitation across difference, I should say. We do a lot of facilitation, but then there's a lot of agreement, and that's handy. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everyone for coming. This recording will be on the Indigilab Network website. I'll put the chat in there, and I'll include the bibliography. It's usually these things get bundled together with other resources of the same type. So if this is your bag, eventually there'll be some other things around it that are similar. But thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And I will close the video, but I'll stay here for a little bit if anyone has a desire for an off-camera chat. Thanks again.